Hello, everyone, and welcome to altPOV.radio. Tonight, our guest is Bill Schroeder, and we're very excited about this. I've been looking forward to this interview for a while. Bill is a U.S. Army veteran and retired homicide detective who was witness to a 1967 incident involving a UFO shutdown of the surface-to-air Hawk missile battery in Key West. Since that happened, Bill has reached out to other military veterans who have had similar experience over the years and today encourages them to share their stories if they're open to doing that. He is currently the MUFON State Section Director for the Tampa Bay, Florida area and works with the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, known as NICAP, on their archive team. And we're really excited, Bill, to have you on the show tonight. Welcome.
Well, great to be here.
We do appreciate your time. I remember meeting your cousin Dennis about a year ago, and we'll talk more about him, obviously, as part of the story, but I met him in Sebring, Florida at a conference, and we started talking, and he started telling me this incredible story, which, of course, most people don't know about, as is usually the case for the most part. When it comes to these things, and it was fascinating, and he was so nice, and he's like, no, you gotta call Bill, he's really nice, he'll talk to you about this. And I'm like, it really caught my attention. It was really compelling. So again, we're looking forward to this. So let's start. We'll set the scene here. It's March 1967, Cold War. Vietnam's going on. Where are you, and what happens that night? Tell us. Let's get into this story.
Well, I was stationed in Key West, Florida, at a Hawk missile battery, and we were on standby mode, so not much was going on. And I was in the battery control center, which is the control room that all the radars and controls are in, and just basically relaxing and laying back. Because we weren't active that particular night. And I was in a conversation with my cousin, who was with the 644th Radar Squadron in Homestead, Florida. Dennis and I had grown up together, and we're more brothers than cousins. And very fortunately, we got stationed very close to each other. And we were also in a position where we could talk all the time because we were both part of NORAD and could get on the communications lines and talk. And actually, we on that particular night, we were the two of us also had a group of nurses from one of the local hospitals in Miami that we were talking to, student nurses who used to date us, and we were having a good time. I was sitting with my feet up I was in the A section chair with my feet up in another chair, and Dennis broke in and he said, I've got to cut this off. I got something going on, because he was a comm center specialist and part-time radar operator. So Dennis came back and he said, "You won't believe it. They're in a real panic. We've got targets coming in from the north, heading towards Miami, unidentified." And I said, "Wow, that's amazing," and sort of skeptical. Dennis was into joking with me all the time, so I didn't know if he was telling me the truth or not, So then he cut me in, and I could hear some of the other chatter, and I realized that this was the real thing. And I recall that they called one of the targets was referred to as a snowbird, and I always tell everybody in our presentation that nowadays a snowbird is from New York, and he's coming to Florida to bring money. But back then, a snowbird was probably a Russian bear bomber bringing nuclear weapons. So it was quite a panic. And of course, we had I had no information where they could have came from, what their approach was, but I knew that they were entering the area. And it's just a few minutes after Dennis said that his radar station was tracking them, I only had to reach over and flip a switch to bring up my own pulse acquisition radar. Now, the PAR is the radar that you see in all the movies, where it's the banana-shaped dish that's spinning around, and it's the acquisition radar. It's strictly for finding planes in the air. And I flipped on and brought up the PAR and had 4 bogeys entering my area, south of the peninsula, cutting across the Keys and heading out into the that area of the Gulf of Mexico between South Florida and Key West. And it was 4 perfect targets. I told Dennis, yeah, I've got 4 targets. Looks like they're supersonic. And he said, yes, we have 4 targets here. We watched them for probably 45 minutes, and it was clear that they were flying in formation. They were making beautiful right and left 90-degree turns and appeared to be flying a grid. I picked that up instantly because we had watched Coast Guard search aircraft, and when they go out and fly a grid and they're searching an area, these guys definitely were flying to some type of grid. They would fly east to west, then go south maybe 50 miles, and then turn back and go west to east, and then back up, and then, So we watched it for a little while, and Dennis and I were conversing. I don't know what they are. I said they're good targets. They're solid. I'm getting a good return on them. They're flying in formation. They're doing turns. And then I saw 4 what we call in the business fast movers, supersonic friendly aircraft that looked like they were lifting off from Boca Chica, probably Phantoms, probably Marine Phantoms. I never was to find out what they were, but they were headed north towards the Miami, South Florida area. And I told Dennis, I said, we're going to know who they are in a minute because I got 4 fast movers headed your way, And the minute that that our aircraft got within like 35 miles of these things, they just disappeared off the scope, which was really amazing. I mean, you're talking about maybe a couple of seconds for a sweep, and between sweeps, they disappeared off the scope. And there were no tadpoles. Tadpoles are on a radar when an aircraft moves laterally. They kind of smear their image, and you call them tadpoles. There was no tadpoles. These things just disappeared between sweeps. And at the time, I thought, well, there's only one way you could do that. You either had to go into the ocean or go straight up over like 200,000 feet instantly, So they were gone, and for just a minute, I had myself convinced that we might have saw some running rabbits, although they didn't look like running rabbits. And let me explain what running rabbits are. Running rabbits are an interference that radars get when 2 radars happen to cross on the same frequencies. And usually the only time that happens is if there's an airborne radar in the area. So when they disappeared after the jets got there, didn't find anything. I sort of had myself convinced that's what they were, because what I'm seeing was just so hard to believe, And I'm an 18-year-old kid. I wasn't a science fiction nut. I've been in all the movies, but I didn't. And by God, the minute that those aircraft ran out of gas, of course they went up there with afterburners, so they didn't have a lot of air time up there. The minute that they turned around and said heading back, when they got like 35 or 40 miles from where these guys were, they came back. Same way, instantaneously between sweeps, and didn't miss a heartbeat, just started their search grid again, just started searching. So, I mean, this went on for about 2.5 hours, 3 hours, all night. I lost track. It was into the morning. Our initial contact was probably 10:30, 11 o'clock at night, and we were now into 1:32 in the morning.
Right.
And and then just at the end of one of these east to west sweeps, one of the targets turned south and started heading right towards me. And this I got really excited about, because at my command was several other radars that perform different functions, and one particular one is called the Illuminator, and it's a strange-looking radar. The Illuminator actually looks like a pair of Mickey Mouse ears, and that's what everybody called it. But it's a very intense beam of RF energy that actually guides the missile. The Illuminator actually radiates the target so much that the Hawk missile, will find it in the sky. So that's the Illuminator's job. Now, the neat thing about the Illuminator is the return signal often brings back some Doppler sounds from the target. If it's a helicopter, you'll hear some of the noise from the rotary blades. If it's a turboprop, you'll hear some different. I mean, I could pick the Bear bombers used to fly around Cuban. I could pick those out in a heartbeat because of the turbine engines, Right. And I brought the Illuminator cursor on them, and it's really funny that I mentioned I was sort of speaking to myself, but I still had the headset on, and Dennis was listening, and I said, "This is Earth versus the flying saucers for real," Yeah. And the bad thing was that was the last thing Dennis was ever going to hear from me that night. So I flipped the illumination switch to lock onto this target, and for just a second, I had a beautiful lock and a beautiful Doppler return. And the amazing thing was the Doppler return was just a solid tone, something I had never heard before. There, I didn't hear any subaudible vibration. I only locked in this guy for like a second, and then all hell broke loose. And if you can imagine, I'm sitting at these. I've got two large radar screens in front of me that are probably 2.5, 3 foot across, and then behind me is the commander screen, which is huge, probably 4 feet across. And I couldn't see the commander screen, but I'm watching these two section screens, and the cursor just stopped and then started going backwards. And while I'm trying to digest that, which was just, there's no way that could happen. Right. Then everything shut down. Everything shut down. We went black. I lost communications. I lost everything. And of course, later, being also repairing, working on these radars along with operating them, I realized that what probably happened was that the polarity of all that RF, all the energy on that site got reversed somehow, which would account for the scopes going backwards because they're DC motors. And, it's just, you reverse polarity, it just goes the other direction for a second till everything burned up,
Right.
So I get out of there, I walk out the front door, and while I was having this adventure in the BCC, we have launcher crewmen that are out on the site taking care of the birds, the missiles. And my launcher crew chief out there was sharp. He was good. The minute the PAR come on, he started paying attention because he knew we were on standby and I must be doing something. And then when the illuminator come on and slewed to the north, well, then they're really interested because that's a locking radar. So you got all these launcher crew looking to the north to see what, try to see what I'm looking at. And of course, then the sight went perfectly black. So the sky was clear. And I came out the door, and running up to meet me was my launcher crew chief, and he says, "Bill, we seen it. What the hell was that?" And I said, "I don't know." He says, "It looked like a meteor, but it was flying level." He says, "It flew level flight right over us. It's headed south." And I said, "Buddy, I have no idea what that was." And I always tell everybody that at that moment I was convinced that I had just tracked a UFO, and my 18-year-old kid was convinced I had tracked a flying saucer because that's what UFOs were to me,
Right.
Let
me ask, what speeds were you getting on these things?
They were okay. My report when they initially approached Miami, they were doing in excess of 5,000 miles an hour and began decelerating quickly. My targets were subsonic to 450 to 650 miles an hour averaging. I think just an assessment of when I first picked up on them, when they cut across the Keys, I'm thinking 1,100 miles an hour. But when they got into that area, that watery area, and again, as we go back and I keep assessing this and looking at it again and again, I actually am able to glean more information because, it was an amazing event, But I remember so clearly, I'm standing outside the BCC, of course, the whole site's in a panic. Everybody's running around screaming and yelling, And all I'd done was look up at the sky with a smile on my face because I knew that I was in on the biggest secret in the world, and I knew I was an insider,
Right.
And the fire control officer ran up to me and said, "What the hell just happened here?" I says, "I don't know, sir. I think we just got shot down by a flying saucer." He says, "I don't even want to hear that kind of crap, So
right, but at this time and at this point, based on everything you all knew, there wasn't anything that either we or the Russians had that could do these things, or were there? I mean, was it obviously 5,000 miles an hour was not something that any of our planes could do, correct?
Yeah, the SR-71 was just in testing phase. I've heard a lot of people tell me it was an SR-71. The SR-71 wasn't flying yet over Cuba. They didn't start till like November or December of that year. This wasn't an SR-71 anyway. I had the opportunity, and I spent hours and days behind this scope. I mean, I knew everything that flew in the sky. In commercial aircraft, Piper Cubs, I mean, we would even sometimes we would lock on the Greyhound bus coming down US 1 just for fun. I mean, I knew what everything was, but I'm serious. But these were supersonic. Okay, now figure, when they were topped out and when they were flying the grid, they were doing 600, 700 miles an hour, and we were doing right turns in formation. I mean, I'm not talking about a right bank. I'm talking about a right angle turn, 90 degrees. There's no way, and that's why I had such trouble when I was sitting there. I'm like, my poor mind is trying to pick what these could be. I mean, I'm going through everything, my entire catalog of knowledge of the radar and aircraft that I've tracked. And there's nothing. There was only one logical answer. These were vehicles from somewhere else. These were something we had never seen before, and there was just no other explanation. And the ECM, the electro countermeasures that this guy or gal or being hit me with,
right,
was just unheard of at that time. They are working on similar ECM now because I've really kept track of it. But the electro countermeasures that he used on me, they just didn't exist then. I mean, this was science fiction, what took place that night, as far as the reality of it.
Right.
And then, then of course I found out many years later about, when he flew south from me. That's probably accounts for the MiG-21 that was lost over Cuba, who had actually tracked and locked on a UFO. Well, I have a family member who is a retired chief engineer with Boeing. I mean, he's a doctor. He's got his PhD, and we talked to him about it, and I said, what would have happened to a MiG-21 supersonic if he would have had the same electronical shutdown that I did? He says, and I quote, "It would have been turned into a flying dumpster. It would have disintegrated." And that's exactly what happened,
And you didn't know this at the time, so
I didn't.
Right.
35 years later, I found out about it. Yeah,
that's incredible. And so that night, so you get pretty much shut down. You're dark now.
Right.
And for the rest of that evening, what happens? You just basically, everyone's talking about this. And
well, it was almost morning before we got done with everything because they wouldn't let me go up and check the radar. They wouldn't let us do anything, and we were assembled there, and it was just, the sun was just coming up when a senior officer who I didn't recognize came out and said, "Don't worry about everything. Everybody's in a panic over nothing. This was just an exercise." And of course, I knew that was,
Yeah.
And I sit there and I said, okay, I said, so is it secret? Is this secret? He says, no, it's not secret, but we'd rather you didn't tell anybody about it, but it was just an exercise. Well, I went back to the barracks and did some thinking about it, and I said, yeah, if they'd have classified it secret, that would have meant it really happened. As long as they didn't classify it, they could say it never happened,
Right.
And of course, poor Dennis, the last words he heard from me was, "This is Earth versus flying sausage for real." And then I went dead. For all he knew, I had been vaporized. He didn't know what happened to me. So I talked to him the following afternoon, and he had been in briefing all morning and half the day. Of course, everything that they shot, all of his radars up there were filmed, they come in the next morning. I believe Dennis said there was a major and 3 plainclothes guys and some other military personnel that came in and took all the film canisters, marked them classified, and carried them out and told them, said, "This never happened, and you'll never tell anybody about it." So then what's amazing is within a month of that, I got orders for Korea, and Dennis got orders. They transferred him out, and then they transferred everybody that was involved in that thing who had direct knowledge of what was seen or tracked away, including Dennis's CO. And they had spent buku money training me on how to do what I'd done, and they had spent buku money training Dennis on what his specialty was. They sent Dennis to Goose Bay, Labrador, and made him an armed forces disc jockey. and they sent me to Korea and made me a military police dog handler. And they jerked us completely out of our jobs.
And all separately. No one was together. Right?
No. And their strategy would work, except Dennis and I were like brothers. We had been close before the military, so we hung together on that story, although we never talked about it, but
right. So you have to, and for our listeners and viewers, it's again 1967. I mean, this not a few years earlier. You had the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, this was a serious time where we were on alert. I mean, we had a perceived communist threat. Which was a threat, and we were in the middle of the Vietnam War. So this was at that time, being your age, you knew that this wasn't what they were saying it was. You knew that there was no way, based on the information that you had gathered, based on your expertise and the other people around you, that this was not U.S. or Russian or anything else for that matter that you knew of. Yet at the same time, you did you feel an obligation? It's like, well, they said don't talk about this. We're not going to talk about this, right? I mean, is that at the time?
Yeah, in the military, you play the game or you pay. So when they said don't talk about it, we really didn't talk about it. We didn't even talk about it between ourselves. I mean, in my unit, like I say, I got out of the service and became a law enforcement officer. Dennis got out of the service and became a law enforcement officer for the state. Dennis worked on white-collar crime. He was an investigator. And then we were in this pocket of, if we'd ever came public, you can imagine if I'm testifying in a homicide trial and somebody come up and said, have you ever seen a flying saucer?
Right.
I'd be done,
Right.
And we kept it in our pocket so much that Dennis and I would be in a car together, or we'd be somewhere together, and we'd see a UFO story or a report of a UFO, and one of us would just look at the other one and say, "Do you remember the night?" And he'd say, "Yeah, I remember." And that would be it. That would be our conversation, for the, and we never, I guess, because we figured if we never talked about it, we'd never make a mistake and talk about it in public.
Right.
And it was only after we both retired that I decided to, I called Dennis one night and I said, "Dennis, you know what, I'm going to do our report." And I think I sent it to the National UFO Reporting Center. And a lot of it was wrong then because, I'd just done it from memory and we didn't compare notes. And what the amazing thing is that after Dennis and I got together and really started exploring what happened and got the maps out, that we realized there was 8 UFOs, not 4. When I said I've got 4 targets, he said, "Yeah, we've got 4 targets too." Well, his targets were over the Atlantic, my targets were over the Gulf of Mexico. And
wow.
You can understand how that could happen. We're in audio communication and the stress is high. And every time I said 4, he said, "Yeah, there's 4 here too." So
right.
And so we separated them, and if people get a chance to see the map, we separate them just for logic and to keep our sanity into A flight and B flight. And it was just amazing. And I actually went back to Key West after Dennis and I went public, and I think it was shortly after we had joined MUFON right from the beginning. I found out that my battery, if you've got any listeners at Key West, the battery is still there. It's now a paintball range out there that belongs to the county. And I actually went back out there and I stood where the BCC was, and it's sort of a reaffirmation for myself. I told Dennis I want to go back,
Yeah.
And when I stood on that slab where the BCC stood, I had that same wave sweep over me. Just like when I was 18, I looked up at the sky and I looked at my old partner who was now retired in Key West, and I looked at Dennis and I said, boy, it really was amazing,
Yeah, that was there was something really special that happened that night.
Yeah.
Now at this point, now you start finding out other things. There were other things going on that night that you didn't know that night. And now I want to get into. We'll talk about a couple things, but apparently, and if you would please elaborate, these objects started getting close to Cuban airspace, so they scrambled a couple of MiGs. Is that correct?
Yes, my first MUFON meeting, I told my story at my first MUFON meeting during the roundtable when everybody shares, and Kathleen Martin, who is a big MUFON researcher and fantastic person, she told me, she said, I've got somebody who needs to talk to you, and she says, can I have your phone number? And I says, yeah. I says, who is it? She said, well, just wait and see, we'll see, but if he needs to talk to you, he'll call you. So I get a call like 2 days later, and it's a Canadian code on and I said, I wonder who's calling me from Canada,
Right.
So I answered the phone, and it says, hi, is this Bill Schroeder? I says, hi, yeah, this is Bill Schroeder. I said, I know who this is. I recognized his voice immediately. It was Stanton Friedman, it was such an honor to have him call me,
Right.
And we talked for probably 2.5 hours, and he had obtained some information from the NSA about their overhearing a Cuban MiG-21 shoot down over Cuba. And I guess a lot of the flack he was getting was, why would these guys shoot down a MiG-21? What would be their reason? And of course, then when he heard about the ECM and how it was a reaction to a lock-on that was probably automatic. Probably the defensive systems of whatever kind of vehicle this is actually done it automatically without, like our fighters do now. Yeah. And that explained a lot, and we had a long conversation. It was really great, and I was so proud to speak to him, and we really helped each other out, because that MiG-21, for that moment in my life, that was the end to the little story I was trying to put together called The Incident Over Miami. That was the cap. That was what was going on. Of course, I still had a lot of information I had no knowledge of at that time.
So basically what happened was that there were two MiG-21s that were scrambled from Cuba, and when one of them locked on to one of these objects, I guess now the wingman is still alive, correct? The other MiG pilot?
I have actually tracked down a possible wingman for him. This is an ongoing investigation, and with Morgan Bell's help. Morgan Bell is the state director of MUFON for Florida. He has some contacts in Cuba, and I have a first name on this gentleman, and I have some of his experience, and so they're trying to track him down, and boy, would that be great, huh? But evidently, the overheard conversation was that the wing leader of the two MiGs locked on the target, and then his wingman said that he had just disintegrated and was gone. And if you can imagine what happened to me, I could just walk out of the BCC and say, damn, what was that? But he was in a supersonic aircraft and losing all avionics and losing all flap control. The poor guy probably couldn't even eject because nothing would have worked. And his aircraft just turned into a piece of junk and just disintegrated in the sky. And there was probably no ill will intended by whoever was in the ship, or it was just collateral damage,
Right. Now, I wonder what they told the family, and that from on the Cuban end, how they had to kind of go about, if he had family. I mean, how do you, and then also too, how do you debrief the wingman, the other pilot? I mean, I'm sure they have to tell him you cannot talk about this, and he probably just lost a friend. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm sure this went through your mind. I mean, what happens after something like that happens from their government standpoint?
Well, yeah, you think of people look at the Cuban regime that's in power now, and they think it's hard. But believe me, the Cuban regime that was in power in 1967 made these guys look like sheep, and they probably just told us, if this wingman would opened his mouth, he probably would have just been disappeared, so he had a bigger threat on him than we ever did here. And, they could have told the family anything they wanted to, because they control the media, they control everything,
Right.
So
a training accident, anything like that.
Yeah, wouldn't have been a big problem for them.
So what other information have you found out? You had mentioned earlier that it seemed like they were searching, these objects were searching for something. There was a grid pattern, and have you learned any more about that, or?
Well, after we started reconstructing everything and working on it, the only thing that always bugged me, and people I'd talked to that were kind of, being questioning about is why they would come there so fast and spend so much time lollygagging around South Florida. And that was always a question for me too. And I just, like in the last 7 or 8 months, things are starting to come forward because I'm going through old newspaper stories. I'm talking to old witnesses. I actually found witnesses on that were there at the Everglades National Park, which was really great because in their statement, in their initial witness statement that they'd done back in 1979, I think, they said that they saw these UFOs out over the Gulf of Mexico and over South Florida, and, quote, they looked like they were searching for something. That was their quote. And
right,
then we had a newspaper boy. I'll give you his first. His name is Bobby. He has sort of come out, and I think he's going to appear with me at one of my meetings. Great guy. Bobby was just a kid. He was a newspaper boy at the time, and delivering the Miami Herald before sunrise. And he had a very close encounter with these things. Flew right over him in South Florida. And what he gave me that correlated so much was he went back home, and his neighbors, his best friend, his father was in the Air Defense Command, and they had tracked the targets that night, and his father suddenly got transferred to the Philippines. They'd done the same thing to him that they'd done to us. And then we also found then the Crestview School thing popped up, and this was around April 1st, would have been like the day after what happened to us, because ours was in the end of March. Within a couple of days, there was actually a landing near Crestview School, and this was witnessed by like 200 school children and teachers and everything. And the object was on the ground for a brief period, then lifted off and went straight off and went out over the Atlantic. And the thing about that is Homestead Air Force Base told everybody, well, it was helicopters. It was a Coast Guard helicopter out there. Well, let me tell you something about a kid who knew about Miami in the 60s. The Crestview School was in Opelika. Opelika had the Coast Guard Air Station was right there in Opelika. And those kids seen Coast Guard helicopters every day, so they knew what a Coast Guard helicopter looked like, and they wouldn't all be out. These kids were screaming and yelling. I mean, they ran out of the classrooms, and what was really amazing was one of the witnesses that gave a story to the newspaper, and I'm still trying to track his family down. I've tracked him down, but he is deceased. He reported that he had his binoculars and he was watching these 4 UFOs out over the Atlantic. And as aircraft approached from the horizon, he said they would just disappear. And then when the aircraft left, they would come back. Well, he was testifying. He was seeing the same thing that we saw on the radar, but he was watching visually. And the minute I read that, I said he was watching a flight. He was watching the flight out over the Atlantic. And so they weren't going straight up or straight down. They were going somewhere else. They were either using some type of cloak or they were just leaving, going somewhere else. But
right.
And he said the minute that the aircraft returned, they would come back. So they were persistent in what they were doing too. They didn't want to leave that area. And when I put it all together, the rapid approach of these craft, the search patterns, and that they were searching for 2 weeks, 3 weeks in that same area, I'm thinking they lost a ship. I'm thinking they responded the same way we would to a mayday from one of our planes that went down. They rushed to the area, and they were trying to find it. And I don't know if they did or not, but and again, that's just conjecture. But based on all the evidence, and I'm a storyboard kind of guy, being a homicide detective. You put the stuff on the storyboard and it points you in one direction, and I'm thinking they lost a ship. That's why they came in so fast, broke up into search patterns, and that's just my. That's what I think.
Well, again, objective reasoning, and it really caused a bit of almost like a UFO flap for a little bit down there in South Florida. I mean, there were people seeing things, and the Crestview, the fact that you found that out, that's incredible. That's really compelling. The fact that so many children and however many teachers saw something land. So here you have this happen to you, and it really, it's true. It's a one-night event in 1967, but it really affects the rest of your life from the standpoint that and there might have been years in between where you didn't pursue it, but all these years later, you're on a journey. You're still on a journey because of what happened that night. Oh. And so tell us a little bit, so you're finding out that obviously there was more going on during not only that evening but during the weeks that followed. The incredible story of the Cuban pilots of what happened there, and hopefully as you're trying to confirm if you can, if you found the pilot somehow and he was willing to talk, that would be unbelievable. But you've also you've found that a lot of military personnel, and especially radar operators, they've had similar experience. Now, a lot of them still don't come forward, but some have, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Some of them just discounted what they've seen. And just so you think I didn't just put this out of my mind for 35 years, the one incident I do remember was really funny when I was still on the street as a street cop. It was probably 1975. We had a little bit of a flap here in the Tampa Bay area where a lot of sightings were. And I got assigned to a call where a woman had said that something had landed beyond the trees by her house. And so I responded, and I got out. I told her, I says, yeah, I'll go check it out for you. Yeah. So I started walking through these trees, and then I stopped in the middle of the trees, knowing what I knew, I said, now what the heck are you going to do if you walk at the other side of these trees and there's a UFO sitting there? So I just stood in a bunch of trees and waved my flashlight around a little bit. Then I walked back out, and I told her, I said, ma'am, I didn't find a thing out there, So just so you know, that wasn't completely out of my mind.
Right, it did affect, exactly. And you knew firsthand what these things were capable of. So
yeah, I didn't want to get fried again, That's what you don't want to do that again,
Yeah, so that's incredible.
So when I started, go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead. So
I started searching for military witnesses, and I put up militaryUFO.com, and was fortunate enough. I went on Kate Valentine and some other shows, and I really pushed military UFO, and some people started coming forward. Also, I do, like you said, I do some archiving for NICAP. In the world of NICAP, I'm at the bottom of the totem pole, but I'm very proud to be a member of NICAP. It's a very small, very professional organization, and I'm proud to be doing the work I do for them. But I do archiving for them. And on a lot of these witness sheets, the witnesses were supposed to be blacked out, but a lot of them are, So I find them that way too, Being an old private investigator, I own my own detective agency. I can find people, So.
Right, you know the tricks. That's good.
And we got reports, and the reports on militaryUFO.com I mean, they're still coming in. I have reports from Desert Storm. I have reports from the Iraq War. It's amazing. And these guys they're still there. They're still seeing it. But the one I remember so much was Jerry. I found this guy that had an occur 1957, very similar to mine. He and other radar stations had tracked UFOs all over the place for an entire evening. And like Jerry, like a lot of my witnesses, when I called him and told him what I was doing, it was like he'd been sitting on this secret for so many years. It poured out of him like he was talking to a priest, confessing. It's the only thing I can say. It was like he was confessing to a priest, because he's never been able to release this. Never been able to just let it go. And Jerry just went on for an hour talking to me. I mean, and what happened to him was amazing. And I told him about the transfers, because he got transferred back to the state right after his sighting. And I told him about it. He said, "Gee, I thought I just got lucky." I said, "No, Jerry, they got rid of you, But talking to these witnesses are fantastic, and everything's pretty much the same. UFOs come into the area. When we go to investigate them, they're gone, and or sometimes it turns out worse. Sometimes we sent fighter aircraft out, and both targets have merged, and we've never seen that pilot again. So it's the same old story right now.
And it's amazing all these years that the modus operandi of the military, who's in charge, who's making these decisions, it seems like you're right. It's the same. They can't stop these things from happening. So obviously they're going to have personnel who have these experiences and very trained, really good witnesses to these events, very credible, that see these things. But I guess it's pretty easy to just say, hey, you were in the military and, you will not talk about this. And I know that, there's a certain amount of an obligation of, I am in the military and this might be really important to national security, so I'm not going to say anything. Or there might be people who see these things but not necessarily believe necessarily what they are, like if they are UFOs or what they might be. So there's probably a lot of that as well, and there probably is a lot of fear of, I better not say anything because I don't want to wind up in jail or worse. Or their career's ruined, like you had said. You had a long career ahead of you. You didn't want to destroy that because you say you saw a UFO. I find that fascinating. Is there a sense of, I know a certain amount of frustration, but I would think that because of now what you're doing, like some of the people you're talking to, there's almost a release of that frustration. There's a release of, we can talk about this. We can actually talk about these things. Do you feel that way?
Oh, yes. When again, like I said, when I get the guys that want to talk verbally, when I get them on the phone and we talk, there's no other word for it. It's a release. Of course, I've vented myself, but they just explode with knowledge. They're so happy that somebody else had the same experience. And because there is that, even though you experienced it yourself, there is that, could this have really happened factor. I mean, it just hangs there. And that's why I went back to Key West and stood on my pad. You just had what happened was such an extraordinary, life-changing event, that even in your own mind, you have this little bit of doubt. And that's why I went looking for witnesses to what happened to, and we found lots of them. We had, like I say, we found the witnesses in the Everglades. I just last year had a Royal Canadian Air Force radar technician come forward and talked about tracking all 8 of those things southbound along the Atlantic coast. I mean, there's no doubt that it happened, and there's no doubt that they were down there on some type of mission, and it's happening every day in the world. Either our military or some other military. I had so many military people come forward that there's just no doubt, and it's still going on.
Right. What is your? Well, let's talk about the story that you've collected so much information. What are your goals there to get the whole story out, or to? I know you talk to people. I know you do presentations. Is that what you want to continue to do that and continue to find out more information about? Not only and really about that event, but also in the process, you're finding out about all these other incidents that have happened too.
I'm a mission-orientated guy. I always have been my whole life. I need a mountain to climb, you know.
And this is a good mountain to climb.
And this is Everest, you know. So
Right.
you know, so and I love it. I love the work I'm doing with NICAP. I love the work that I'm doing with MUFON. I meet so many interesting people, and we share experiences. And you know, I none of this would have happened if I hadn't. I gotta thank MUFON and especially Terry Ling, you know, my local, you know, because that's when I really opened up when I went to a MUFON meeting and spoke to Terry and felt like I could talk to these people because I had people around me, it's kind of like an AA meeting, I guess, you know.
No, absolutely.
But now I don't know. I sort of would like to work on another book, probably a very, very more involved book than Incident Over Miami. Incident Over Miami was basically just a pamphlet. You know, it's just a little story that I had to put down before I got sick. I got rheumatoid arthritis. It's almost impossible for me to type. Thank God my wife took all my notes and made them into something that was readable.
Right.
And she'll probably, I'll probably dump all this on her desk, and I'm thinking about maybe, using the title Unknown Down, and putting a little bit of conjecture in it that, based on what I've seen, what could have happened, and it's going to be a what could have happened, but there's no doubt there was a flap over Miami that, for almost a month. They were all over the place down in South Florida. So, and of course every time I find one of these, or every time I talk to a witness, I say, I'm so self-satisfied. It's just wonderful, and I know I'm helping them too. These witnesses who are able to get this out, and like Jerry is 75 years old. Eventually, he's going to be gone, and that story would be gone with him. That entire incident that he had in Alaska would be gone with him, and what a loss to ufology. We need to get as many of these witnesses to come forward and tell their stories and do the interviews so that they can be part of our knowledge.
Needs to be documented. What would you tell a young military kid today, 18, 19, 20 years old, if tonight, he had a similar experience? If you could tell him one thing, what would you say?
Try to make as many mental notes about what you've seen and draw your own conclusions. Don't let anybody tell you what you saw. If you're experienced in your equipment and you know what you saw, you don't need somebody to tell you what you experienced. And if you've got to sit on it and keep it personal between you and your family, that's what you'll have to do till you get when you're ready to release it.
Oh, that's great. That's good. And do you feel? Are you upset or disappointed or angry or any of those things when it comes to the military, the way the military handles these, or is there part of you that thinks, well, they have no choice but to handle it this way? How do you feel about that? You're ex-military. How do you feel?
Yeah, I really think that they have no choice. You can't go on especially in the 60s during the Cold War, how in the world could the United States Air Force or any military organization or a government go on the air and say, there are things flying through our airspace that we have no control over. They're going to be able to do anything they want to do, and we're powerless. But that's the story. That's exactly what the story is.
Right.
You can't tell the American people that, So
Right.
I fully understand their position. They're in a bad position.
Right. And I think people forget that, and we want to get angry. We don't like to be left in the dark, but at the same time, I think that it could cause panic. I mean, if there's no solution to something, and it's going to cause panic and chaos, even at the very least in people's belief systems. That's a tough thing to deal with.
Oh yeah, I've heard so many people tell me, no, the American people can handle it. You can tell them the truth. The American people can't handle it when a chicken gets pox over in China. Immediately we all start running to our doctor Can you imagine? Could you imagine if a saucer landed in Central Park?
Right.
Like to steal a line from Ghostbusters, dogs and cats living together. The pure hysteria. I mean,
Yeah.
it would be pure hysteria. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's just such a fascinating story. Well, let's talk a little bit. What do you do? Tell us about what you do for MUFON now, and the kind of the things you're doing, and talk about that a little bit.
Well, I'm a state section director for the Tampa Bay area, which includes Hillsborough, Pinellas, Manatee County, probably the second biggest metropolitan area in the state. And it keeps me pretty busy. I do meetings here. You can, if you're local, catch us on meetup.com. You're welcome to come to our meetings, and we try to have different subjects that we study during the meetings. Like how to watch the sky, how to report a UFO. We investigate some specific incidences, like we just done a presentation on the Run from Forest incident. And I'm actually going to do incident over Miami, which is now the Miami flap at our Brandon, Florida. And I do that, and I'm tied up in a group. I've just started an organization called MAST, MUFON Aerial Surveillance Team. I went to a Skywatch when I first joined MUFON. I went to a couple of Skywatches, and a Skywatch is sort of a party. Everybody's got their night vision out, and it didn't take me long to realize that almost everything that they seen in the sky, was piquing their interest, and being the guy that I am, I said we've got to figure a way to separate what is from what isn't. Right. So MAST is dedicated to identifying the things in the sky. Like I tell everybody, we've got one computer dedicated to watching the sky and 3 other computers dedicated to telling us what it is. I have satellite tracking, aircraft tracking, so we can find a target and look at the satellite tracking, look at the aircraft tracking. If it's not on any of those, then we can take a look at it and try to examine what it is. And I personally think that seeing one of these things in the sky is 1,000 to 1 chance. So if you get your chance, you better be ready and be able to do it right. And that's the whole thing behind MAST. And Morgan is behind me, and Jan, the director of MUFON, is supporting it. So, and it's in its infancy now. It's being tested in Florida, but it looks like it's going to be a lot of fun, and it really brings professionalism to the whole Skywatch thing. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's a great methodology, a great way to go about doing that. And where can people tell people again about the where military, either veterans or current military people can go somewhere and share their stories or reach out to someone?
Yes. Okay. The site is militaryufo.com. And it's a very sparse. It's not a fancy site, but you'll get, if you want to report a UFO, it'll bring you to a Google form, which goes to me. No one, if you don't want to be contacted, you'll never be contacted. You can make an anonymous report. I don't care. You can make an anonymous report there. If you want to send me a personal email, I'll give you that right now. It's mufonman@gmail.com. You can't forget that email address, So send it to mufonman@gmail.com. Tell me, just put in the subject, put military encounter, so I know that, because they are handled completely differently. These are put in a separate file. They are not kept on site here. I go way out of my way to make sure that these are secret. I share the data with everybody, but the sources are 100% secret. And believe me, as a retired cop, I know how to handle confidential information. So nobody's going to find out where it came from. And if you want to talk to me, give me your phone number, or you send me an email. I'll give you mine, and we'll talk. But I love it. I love it. Love the military project.
Good. No, that's great. All right, last I'd like to end on this, because I've been wanting to ask you this. Based on what happened to you and everything you've learned since, if you had to throw a theory out there based on what's happening, what is this? What is going on in the skies? What would you say? It's an open-ended question, but if you had to,
No, and as a real conservative thinker like I am, it's surprising to hear me say that I believe that we are being visited by multiple races. That explains the different vehicles that are seen, that we have been visited for thousands of years. I personally don't believe there's a lot of interaction between us. I believe that they do occasionally abduct people. These are rare. You have to sift through all the objection reports, in my mind, to find a good one, a real one. But I believe they are extraterrestrial vehicles from somewhere else. The transportation problem, that's the only argument you always hear is, well, there's too much space between us. Yeah, by our science, but we got to remember they aren't playing by our rules, So that's not even something I worry about,
And you experience that firsthand, that they're not playing by our rules.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. They don't even have our rule book, so they don't need to worry about that. That's my personal opinion,
No, that's fascinating. And especially, one of the things that stood out was the fact that when our aircraft approached these craft, they disappeared, and it didn't necessarily go up or down. They just disappeared. So, and again, it's like, what could that be? Could it be phasing in and out interdimensionally, cloaking device? So you're getting into a lot of super technology here that cloaking now, we have some of that ability, but it's certainly to phase in and out like that, and to be completely invisible even on radar, not just on radar, but visibly. That's pretty high end stuff. So, again, probably a lot. You talk about these things, and it's so enlightening, and I think it leaves a lot of people with more questions sometimes that come up. Like, well, what did Bill? And I think one of the things we like to do as you continue your research. And the more you find out, we'd love to have you back on to talk about, other things and anything really you'd like to talk about. We really do appreciate you sharing your story and coming on. I think our viewers will be really fascinated by this, just as I was when I first heard about it. And really providing some of the details that you have it's really been a pleasure. I want to thank you, Bill, and again, hopefully we can have you back on again someday, and I know you and I'll probably talk more as well, but we'd love to have you back on the show.
Yeah, it'd be a pleasure. And one final thing I forgot to tell you, I just recently found out, like 2 months ago, I talked about the tone that came back from the radar, that clear, crisp tone with no subaudible.
Yes.
I actually talked to an engineer from Raytheon who made the radar just a couple months ago. And he laughed. He said, "It's very easy why that happened." And I said, "Okay, go ahead." He said, "Your target had no moving parts."
Wow. That's a great way to end this. The people will really be scratching their heads. Fascinating. Bill, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
Okay, take care now.
Bye-bye.